Some murderers carry knives, others use guns, rope, or blunt force. But in the corridors of pristine hospitals, hidden under the hum of fluorescent lights and antiseptic air, there are killers who don't need to lift a weapon. They write prescriptions, they adjust IV bags, they change dosages, and walk away unnoticed. When they kill, the room stays quiet, the body cools without panic, and by the time anyone questions the death, the paperwork is already filed. Michael Swango didn't wear a mask or stalk alleyways. He wore a white coat and carried a stethoscope. And under that professional exterior, he concealed one of the most calculating serial killing sprees in American history, stretching across multiple states, countries, and institutions. Hospitals meant to heal became his hunting ground. Patients became experiments, and the healthcare system itself became an accomplice. Swango's medical career began with brilliance on paper. He graduated from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine in 1983. But even during clinical rotations, his peers noticed an unsettling pattern. Patients assigned to him often suffered sudden complications or died unexpectedly. Despite these concerns, the university approved his graduation. His first residency was at Ohio State University Medical Center. Within months, nurses reported a spike in patient deaths when he was on duty. Patients who had been stable suddenly coded, often without explanation. Nurses voiced their concerns to supervisors. One patient, an elderly woman recovering well from surgery, abruptly deteriorated and died minutes after Swango administered an injection. Another, a middle-aged man recovering from pneumonia, suffered a seizure after Swango adjusted his IV. The administration noted the complaints and buried them. No formal action was taken. Swango continued his rotations, and the deaths continued too. The hospital quietly launched an internal review but didn't alert authorities. Instead of halting his access to vulnerable patients, Swango was allowed to transfer departments. During one of these reviews, hospital staff suspected that he had injected a patient with an unprescribed chemical. Toxicology wasn't performed. The patient was buried. The file was closed. Administrators feared the fallout of scandal and lawsuits. Their solution was simple: let him resign. And so, with his license intact and no criminal record, Swango left Ohio State and began applying elsewhere. In 1984, he took a position as an EMT in Quincy, Illinois. Again, things started dying. This time, it wasn't patients. It was his co-workers. Paramedics who shared meals or drinks with him fell violently ill. At first, it was dismissed as food poisoning or coincidence, but the pattern was too sharp, too specific. One EMT collapsed and suffered seizures after drinking iced tea from the station fridge. Another experienced extreme nausea and neurological symptoms after eating a sandwich Swango had prepared. Suspicion mounted. Finally, a co-worker reported him to police. This time, investigators acted. They searched Swango's apartment and found a makeshift chemistry lab, dozens of poisons, and notebooks filled with cryptic notes on dosages, symptoms, and ideal conditions for testing. He was arrested in 1985 and convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his co-workers. He served 2 years in prison. But upon release, he quickly began rebuilding his identity. He changed his name on job applications and leveraged outdated credential checks. Despite his criminal record, the fragmented medical system allowed him back in. He applied for a surgical internship at the University of South Dakota School of Medicine and was accepted. The administrators claimed they were unaware of his past conviction. He was issued a medical license in South Dakota and later applied for one in New York. Each time, background checks failed. Swango, now confident in the system's blind spots, pressed forward. His next known position was at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, Long Island. Again, patients began dying. The deaths weren't violent. They were sudden and subtle. A veteran recovering from a minor infection went into respiratory arrest hours after Swango's shift. A diabetic patient coded inexplicably after an insulin adjustment. Nurses filed multiple incident reports. One staff member noticed that medication logs were altered. Another saw Swango in the drug supply room without authorization. A pattern emerged, and this time, someone listened. In 1993, the hospital suspended him and launched an investigation. But before a full inquiry could take place, Swango fled. He applied for a job overseas, presenting forged documents. Zimbabwe welcomed him into their national hospital system without question. His victims followed. When Michael Swango arrived in Zimbabwe in late 1994, he stepped off the plane not as a convicted felon, but as a respected physician. Armed with forged credentials, a polished demeanor, and the ability to manipulate trust with ease, he began work at Manene Lutheran Mission Hospital under the alias Dr. Daniel J. Adams. The remote facility was understaffed and overwhelmed, and Swango's American medical training gave him instant authority. No one verified his background. No one questioned his past. And soon, patients at the rural hospital began dying. The patterns mirrored his earlier crimes. Individuals recovering from routine procedures experienced sudden cardiac arrests, mysterious seizures, and unexplainable comas. Nurses noted that incidents occurred almost exclusively during his rounds or shortly after he administered medication. Families were confused, but in rural Zimbabwe, suspicions often went unspoken. There was no toxicology testing, no formal autopsies, only quiet funerals and another empty bed. But Swango's past was catching up with him. Back in the United States, the FBI had launched a deeper investigation into a series of deaths at the Veterans Affairs hospitals. Swango's fingerprints were linked to the incidents in Long Island, and his trail through South Dakota and Illinois began to look like a spiderweb of medical homicides. When agents learned he had fled the country, they began issuing international alerts. Meanwhile, in Zimbabwe, several colleagues grew concerned. One doctor, suspicious of Swango's pattern, contacted American officials after recognizing his photo on a State Department bulletin. At the same time, nurses in Zimbabwe reported unexplained muscle relaxant shortages from the hospital pharmacy. Word spread, and before authorities could make an arrest, Swango quietly disappeared once again. He resurfaced in Namibia briefly, then vanished. Authorities traced his flight to Europe, where he attempted to apply for a job with the Saudi Arabian medical system. This time, U.S. agents were waiting. In June 1997, Swango was detained at Chicago O'Hare International Airport after returning to the U.S. authorities used immigration fraud as the legal mechanism for arrest. A technicality that held him in custody, while the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the VA built a broader murder case. Investigators reviewed hundreds of pages of medical records, prescription logs, and personnel files from his various postings. Interviews were conducted with former co-workers, patients' families, and hospital staff. The case grew massive, covering over a dozen states and spanning more than 15 years. Analysts cross-referenced death certificates and autopsy reports, where available, against Swango's schedules and known access to medications. Patterns emerged. The deaths were often sudden, medically inconsistent, and tied to patients who had been recovering normally. Though many cases lacked physical evidence, the circumstantial web was undeniable. Swango's written notes contained entries discussing poisons like succinylcholine and epinephrine, agents that, in the right dosage, caused cardiac arrest and were nearly impossible to detect post-mortem. Swango initially denied all allegations, portraying himself as the victim of a bureaucratic witch hunt. but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. He eventually entered a guilty plea in 2000 to avoid the death penalty. He was convicted on charges of murder, fraud, and lying to federal officials, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing phase, the FBI submitted a report attributing as many as 60 deaths to him, making Swango one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. No formal confession was ever issued, no remorse was recorded. Instead, a void of silence followed, interrupted only by the cold procedural aftermath. Reissued death certificates, internal hospital audits, and civil settlements with victims' families. The system had failed at nearly every level. Licensing boards hadn't cross-checked records. Hospitals prioritized reputation over red flags. And a man had walked through the front doors of multiple medical institutions, killing patients under the guise of care. Swango is currently housed at ADX Florence, the supermax federal prison in Colorado, known for containing the nation's most dangerous inmates. His cell is monitored 23 hours a day. He is barred from practicing or studying medicine. There are no visitors, no interviews granted. His story is a case study in procedural collapse, how bureaucracy, negligence, and fragmented credentialing created the perfect storm for an intelligent predator to thrive. Medical oversight agencies across the country reformed their credential verification procedures following the case. Background checks became more rigorous. State boards improved communication. But for dozens of victims, those changes came far too late. Families never received proper cause-of-death explanations. Some patients were buried under assumptions of natural failure when in reality, their lives ended in moments of silent betrayal. Swango didn't use chaos. He used access. He didn't lure strangers. He entered their rooms with a clipboard and a smile. His methods were clean, his hands legally gloved, and his crimes hidden behind the very systems meant to protect. He didn't select victims based on appearance, background, or gender. He chose opportunity, the patients who trusted him, the co-workers who never questioned him, the supervisors who feared scandal more than accountability. What made Michael Swango's crimes terrifying was not just their scope, but their setting. He operated not in darkness, but in fluorescent-lit corridors surrounded by nurses, doctors, and oversight committees. And still, he was invisible. His story ended not with a dramatic manhunt or late-night arrest, but with a customs flag, a forged resume, and a final flight home, intercepted not by accident, but by persistence. While some killers disappear into myth or memory, Swango's case remains open in a different way, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always hiding. Some are charting vitals, administering meds, and updating charts. And sometimes they never needed to run. They simply needed to be believed. Edward Wayne Edwards wasn't a shadow. He was the spotlight. While most serial killers retreat into obscurity, hiding in the margins of society, Edwards operated in plain view. He was the rare predator who stepped into the public eye willingly, not just undetected, but celebrated. In the 1970s, he toured the country giving motivational speeches about his transformation from criminal to reformed citizen. He wrote an autobiography titled Metamorphosis of a Criminal and appeared on national television. At public forums, he lectured youth about avoiding the mistakes he made as a young felon, even while crisscrossing the country with his wife and children in a camper. A mobile life built on reinvention. But behind the image was a trail of bodies, crimes spanning decades, states, and victim profiles. His weapon wasn't brute force or rage, it was manipulation, charm, and an instinct for knowing exactly when and how to strike without leaving a trace. Edwards built his life like a con, and his murders were just another extension of the script. He had been in and out of prison in his early years, primarily for robbery and impersonation. In each facility, he observed systems, watched people, and learned weaknesses. He escaped from prison more than once, and each time, he resurfaced with a new name and story. He studied human behavior the way others study mechanics, with precision and intent. By the time he committed his first known murder in 1977, Edwards was already a seasoned deceiver. That year, in Ohio, a young couple, Billy Lavaco and Judith Straub, were found shot execution-style in a park. No witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive. The crime scene was carefully arranged, the bodies positioned, the shell casings collected. Police initially suspected gang involvement or a personal vendetta. The case went cold. Edwards left the state within days. He had already begun his next reinvention. In the early 1980s, another double homicide occurred, this time in Wisconsin. Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, a young couple attending a wedding, vanished from a hotel parking lot. Their bodies were discovered in separate locations weeks later, both strangled. Police had little to work with. There was no sign of a struggle in the parking lot. Witnesses remembered nothing unusual, and there were no fingerprints, DNA, or forensic markers left behind. Edwards had worked as a handyman at the same venue using a false name. He had been there during the wedding, moving unnoticed among guests, setting up chairs, checking lights. When questioned by police, he provided a generic alibi and no reason for suspicion. He left town again, changing vehicles, altering documents, and settling elsewhere. The couple's murder was filed as unsolved. Edwards moved on. He maintained the illusion of normalcy with alarming skill. In one city, he joined a church. In another, he volunteered for local events. He often posed as a former law enforcement officer or military veteran. At times, he even inserted himself into active investigations, offering unsolicited advice or criticizing how the police handled missing persons cases. The irony was chilling. By inserting himself into the communities he targeted, he deflected suspicion. He committed crimes with a rehearsed confidence that left investigators grasping at smoke. The randomness of the victims, different ages, backgrounds, and locations, prevented law enforcement from connecting the dots. There was no consistent weapon, no ritual signature, just clean exits and unsolvable scenes. Edwards understood that patterns were liabilities, so he avoided them. Behind closed doors, he kept detailed journals, recording not only aliases and personal notes, but subtle reflections on how he manipulated each situation. These journals would later become crucial in reconstructing his movements. He used cash, avoided consistent routines, and maintained just enough distance between his legitimate activities and his crimes to keep suspicion away. He registered vehicles under different names, shifted rental addresses monthly, and relied on fake job references. At one point, he even worked for a police academy, assisting with background checks, a chilling irony considering his own record. That job placed him in contact with law enforcement systems, giving him insight into how suspects were vetted and how background checks were processed. He learned what red flags could trigger interest and how to avoid them. The people around him never suspected a thing. His wife and children moved with him from town to town, living under a veil of constant travel and reinvention. They were used to new addresses, new jobs, and abrupt departures. Neighbors recalled him as polite, helpful, even charismatic. There were no outbursts, no visible instability, just the quiet confidence of a man who seemed endlessly adaptable. But each stop left a scar, a body, a missing person report, or a cold case file tucked into a forgotten cabinet. And as the years passed, Edwards remained untouchable. His face never appeared on wanted posters. His name never surfaced in connection with the crimes. He operated like a ghost in daylight, seen but never truly known. By the time the FBI began linking his name to multiple unsolved homicides in the early 2000s, Edwards was living under yet another identity, retired and seemingly harmless. It wasn't forensic evidence that unraveled his illusion. It was time, and a single break that would force open the lid on a case that had quietly stretched for over 3 decades. The break came not from a witness or confession, but from science. In 2009, decades after the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, a cold case unit in Wisconsin submitted evidence for retesting using advanced DNA techniques unavailable at the time of the original investigation. A preserved cigarette butt found near the crime scene, previously untraceable, returned a match to Edward Wayne Edwards, whose DNA had been entered into the federal database after a minor unrelated offense. Investigators reopened the case with renewed urgency. Edwards, then living in Kentucky under his legal name, was 76 years old. His home was searched under warrant. Inside, detectives found decades of records, personal journals, photos, letters, and documents tying him to multiple aliases and interstate travel that matched the timeline of several unsolved murders. One journal included references to the couple in Wisconsin with cryptic notations and veiled self-congratulations. The evidence was enough for arrest. Edwards was taken into custody without resistance. At first, he denied everything, but when confronted with the DNA match and the mountain of circumstantial data, he began to talk. Over a series of interviews, he confessed not only to the 1980 murders of Hack and Drew, but to the 1977 Ohio double murder of Billy Lavaco and Judith Straub as well. Investigators were stunned by his clarity, his precision, and the complete lack of remorse. He recounted the crimes in a linear, methodical way, not to relive the experience, but as if recounting items on a checklist. He offered details never made public, describing crime scenes, victim behavior, and locations that matched police records. But what disturbed agents most was how calm he remained. There were no theatrics, just answers. The deeper they looked, the wider the net grew. Edwards' journals referenced locations, dates, and individuals that couldn't all be identified. Authorities reopened dozens of unsolved homicides from the 1970s through the 1990s that shared common elements: staged scenes, double homicides, and mobile killers. The FBI compiled a timeline of Edwards' known residences and travel history, overlaying them with unsolved case data. The overlaps were alarming. While only 5 murders were officially confirmed and attributed to him, analysts believe the true number could be as high as 20, if not more. Edwards never offered a total. He admitted only to what he was confronted with, no more, no less. There were no apologies, no rationalizations, only facts offered in sequence. In 2010, Edwards was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Hack and Drew. He received additional life sentences in Ohio for the earlier double homicide. Prosecutors in other states considered charges, but halted proceedings after he fell ill in custody. Before he could stand trial for more murders, he died in April 2011 from natural causes. No further confessions were obtained. No final statements were issued. His journals remained sealed under court order. For law enforcement, Edwards was a reminder that not all killers lurk in darkness. Some wear smiles, carry resumes, and build trust as their camouflage. He didn't kill in clusters or follow familiar routes. He killed in gaps, years apart, states apart, never long enough to form a pattern, but just long enough to erase one. The tragedy of Edwards' story wasn't only in the deaths he caused, but in the lives he manipulated. Families trusted him, authorities overlooked him, and a nation once celebrated him as a model of rehabilitation. His crimes spanned time and geography in a way few killers ever achieved. But where his legacy ends in ambiguity, the next man left no such uncertainty. His crimes were recorded not in hidden journals, but in high-resolution photographs. His charm wasn't used to blend in, it was broadcast to millions. While Edwards lived in disguise, Rodney Alcala presented himself on stage. And the mask he wore was confidence. Rodney Alcala didn't just blend in, he thrived in the open. Where most serial killers concealed their violence under layers of secrecy, Alcala presented a polished version of himself to the world, well-spoken, sharply dressed, and intellectually impressive. His intelligence quotient reportedly exceeded 130. He had a background in fine arts, worked as a photographer, and even spent time at UCLA and NYU under the mentorship of famed film director Roman Polanski. But the degrees and charisma masked a far darker reality, that beneath the surface lived one of the most prolific and manipulative serial killers in American history. The man authorities would later call the dating game killer moved across states and decades with a cold, strategic precision, using his charm, camera, and instincts not to seduce, but to stalk, trap, and kill. His murders weren't chaotic outbursts, they were rehearsed scenes, carried out with deliberate control, often documented through his lens. His killing career began long before he ever appeared on television. In 1968, at the age of 25, Alcala lured an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood apartment under the guise of taking her photograph. A passerby intervened, and the girl survived. Alcala fled the state, making his way to New York, where he changed his name and enrolled in film school at NYU. During this time, he was added to the FBI's most wanted list. Despite his fugitive status, he continued to move freely through academic circles, evading authorities for years. In 1971, he was finally arrested and extradited to California for the assault. But the prosecution was complicated by the victim's refusal to testify, and Alcala served only 34 months in prison. He was released, and almost immediately returned to his pattern of calculated violence. Unlike impulsive killers, Alcala planned his movements, choosing victims with care, often engaging them in conversation before striking. He was known to carry a camera, which he used both as a lure and a weapon, snapping photos of women and children in public places, parks, and beaches. Some agreed to be photographed, unaware they were entering the orbit of a predator. Others never got the chance to say no. Alcala didn't rely on a consistent method of killing, which made him harder to profile. His known victims were strangled, bludgeoned, or sexually assaulted, but the order and combination varied. Some were posed after death, others left in remote locations. His crimes stretched across California, New York, and potentially other states, yet no clear geographic pattern emerged. Instead, he adapted to his surroundings. He killed where he was comfortable, where he could escape quickly, and where trust could be manufactured fast. In 1977, he appeared on the hit TV show The Dating Game, introduced to millions as a successful photographer who enjoys skydiving and motorcycling. He won the show, selected by the female contestant. But after one off-camera conversation, she found him so unsettling that she refused to go on the date. What the public didn't know at the time was that during his television appearance, Alcala had already killed, and he would kill again shortly after. While his crimes were scattered, his process was deeply methodical. He kept trophies from many of his victims, earrings, pieces of clothing, and especially photographs. When police later searched his storage locker, they found over 1,000 images, many of unidentified women and girls, some in clear distress, others posed unnaturally. Authorities believed many of the photograph subjects were never reported missing. The camera served multiple purposes. It provided him cover, allowing him to approach strangers under the guise of art or modeling. It gave him power, capturing the moment of vulnerability or fear in real time. And it preserved the memory in an archive of control that he could revisit. For Alcala, photography wasn't a hobby. It was a hunting tool. One of his most well-documented murders occurred in 1979 when 12-year-old Robin Samsoe disappeared while riding her bike to ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. Her body was found in the Angeles National Forest nearly 2 weeks later. Witnesses reported a strange man taking pictures of Samsoe and her friend at the beach earlier that day. A sketch based on their descriptions matched Alcala. His parole officer identified him. A search of his storage locker revealed earrings belonging to Samsoe and photographs of other potential victims. Alcala was arrested and charged with her murder, but what followed wasn't swift justice. It was a legal marathon. He was convicted in 1980, sentenced to death, and then had the verdict overturned in 1984 due to juror misconduct. He was tried again in 1986, convicted again, and had the second verdict overturned in 2001 on procedural grounds. 2 decades passed, and the families of victims waited while legal technicalities dragged on. It wasn't until 2010 that Rodney Alcala stood trial once more, this time for 5 murders, including Samsoe and 4 Los Angeles women killed between 1977 and 1979. By then, advances in DNA technology had linked him to additional victims, including some whose deaths had long been classified as unrelated cold cases. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA matched to semen, bite marks, and other biological traces. Timelines aligned. Photographs tied him to locations and victims. Alcala, representing himself in court, presented a rambling, disjointed defense that only highlighted his arrogance and detachment. He played portions of his television appearance for the jury and spoke at length about topics unrelated to the case. His lack of remorse was unmistakable. He was convicted and sentenced to death once again, this time without appeal. Authorities believe Alcala's true body count far exceeds the 7 confirmed murders. Some estimates place the number over 100. Dozens of photographs from his recovered collection remain unidentified, many depicting women and children who have never come forward. The FBI released hundreds of the photos to the public, hoping to identify additional victims. Each image is now a question mark, a potential tragedy never recorded, a story never told. Alcala died in 2021 at the age of 77, having spent years on death row. He never admitted to further killings. He never explained the photos. He never showed remorse. Where Edwards was a ghost who changed names and stories to stay hidden, Alcala was something more unnerving. A predator who stood in front of cameras, charmed audiences, and let the world applaud him. He didn't wear a disguise. He didn't hide behind another life. He was the performance. And the only reason he was caught was because his need to document everything, every pose, every expression, every moment of vulnerability, left behind an archive of evidence too large to stay buried. But where Alcala used performance and trophies to orchestrate his crimes, the next man built a system, not through entertainment or fraud, but through numbers. His murders were logged, scored, and categorized like entries in a ledger. While some serial killers collect mementos, Randy Kraft kept a list, and every number had a name. The photographs were never just mementos. They were records of domination, of control, of trophies frozen in time. When investigators first opened the storage locker belonging to Rodney Alcala, they had expected evidence related to his known victims. What they found instead was a carefully organized archive of over 1,000 images, many of women and girls whose identities remain unknown. Some were posed naturally, others uncomfortably, Some smiled, perhaps unaware of who was behind the lens. Others stared blankly, their expressions unreadable. A handful appeared distressed or disoriented, clothing partially removed, hair messy, faces blurred by motion or tears. For detectives, it was less a discovery than a map. One that hinted at far more than the 5 murders for which Alcala had been convicted. The trove of photographs didn't just tell stories. It whispered at hundreds of them, some likely ending in murder, others lost to time, unreported or misclassified as missing persons. Each image had to be analyzed, cross-referenced, and tracked against old records. And with every match, a case once considered cold burned back to life. Alcala's methodical nature became clearer with each layer investigators peeled back. He maintained loose consistency with his kill zones, often operating in public spaces like beaches, hiking trails, or city parks. Places that offered visibility, but also anonymity. He was never sloppy. He didn't leave forensic evidence unless it was unavoidable. When he did, it wasn't discovered until years later, after scientific techniques had evolved. He used his camera as both a psychological lure and a smokescreen. In the late 1970s, photography was associated with art, glamour, and magazine-style opportunity. Many women in California at the time aspired to modeling, acting, or television. Alcala exploited that dream. He offered photo sessions, portfolio building, or simply said he was scouting talent. He carried professional equipment, spoke fluently about angles and lighting, and projected an air of legitimacy. Some victims entered his apartment willingly. Others were likely abducted after initial contact. What unified them wasn't how he approached, but how he disappeared. He left no trails. His apartment leases were brief. His neighbors remembered him, but few knew his name. In cities like Los Angeles and New York, his presence barely registered. When detectives finally pieced together the geographical scope of his crimes, it extended across at least 6 states. California and New York had confirmed murders. Investigators in Washington, Wyoming, and Arizona began reviewing old case files for matches based on his known travel records. Alcala had worked briefly at a restaurant in Seattle in 1979, at the same time that a 21-year-old waitress vanished after the evening shift. Her case was reopened. In New York, where he'd once studied under Roman Polanski at NYU, authorities reviewed student and faculty disappearances from the late 1960s. The more they looked, the more connections appeared, some circumstantial, others backed by DNA and physical evidence. In several instances, Alcala had been arrested on unrelated charges, possession of marijuana, trespassing, or minor assault, and released without further scrutiny. At least twice he was questioned in connection to disappearances, but cleared due to lack of evidence. The system had tagged him as odd, sometimes creepy but not dangerous. That gap in perception gave him time. It gave him distance, and it gave him access to victims who had no reason to fear the man behind the camera. One aspect that set Alcala apart from other serial offenders was his uncanny ability to manipulate perception. He didn't need to disguise himself because his real personality was carefully engineered for social acceptability. He spoke in full sentences, used advanced vocabulary, and referenced art and music to bond with strangers. He blended into college campuses, slipped into bars and social events, and knew how to read the temperature of a room. That social intelligence, the ability to shift tone, adjust posture, and control conversation, was part of what made his crimes so difficult to track. He left his victims feeling disarmed, sometimes intrigued, sometimes wary, but rarely alarmed enough to run. It wasn't until years later, when his full record was reconstructed, that authorities saw the pattern of arrests, releases, and proximity to murder sites. And by then, the trail had already gone cold in dozens of jurisdictions. In 2010, after his final conviction, authorities began publishing the photos found in his storage unit. Hundreds were released online through the FBI's website. Families across the country submitted tips. Some recognized daughters or nieces who had vanished decades earlier. A few names were confirmed. Many weren't. One woman, photographed smiling on a fire escape in San Francisco, was identified as a local college student who disappeared in 1978. Her body was never found. Another, shown reclining on a carpet with a dazed expression, matched the description of a missing person from Wyoming, a case that had gone unsolved since 1979. For every match, there were 5 more without context. No names, no records, just faces. The FBI cataloged each one, hoping time would eventually bridge the gap between evidence and resolution. Meanwhile, Alcala sat in his death row cell at San Quentin, declining interviews, refusing to speak. His silence created a wall that no investigator could scale. Even after death, his legacy continued through boxes of film, crime scene folders, and the painful vacuum left in families still searching for closure. The toll of his crimes isn't measured only in victims, but in uncertainty. Forensic experts believe Alcala's total number of victims could exceed 130. The confirmed cases stand at 8. That gap between evidence and proof, between suspicion and certainty, defines the legacy of his pathology. His need to document, to archive, and to retain control even after death offers rare insight into the mind of a killer obsessed not just with power, but permanence. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to record the moment, to freeze his victims in time, to own something that would last. The photographs ensured that. And because of them, his victims, named and unnamed, remain visible, even if their voices never returned. Where Alcala's crimes were filtered through the frame of a lens, the next killer kept no photographs, no trophies, no videos. He kept a list, a coded spreadsheet of horror known only to him. He didn't perform on television. He didn't write books or record interviews. He logged his murders like a project, organized by place, method, and date. Every mark on the page was a death. Every nickname was a code. And for years, Randy Kraft drove the California highways with a body in the passenger seat and a notebook on the floor, a quiet accountant of murder. The freeway blurred beneath his tires, a constant gray ribbon stretching from Orange County to Riverside, from San Diego to Sacramento. Randy Kraft had memorized the roads, not just the highways, the exits, the rest stops, the turnouts shielded by trees, the alleys without lighting. He knew which stretches had no surveillance, which off-ramps fed into undeveloped terrain, and which bridges ran over rivers deep enough to carry away a body. For more than a decade, he used California's freeway system not to travel, but to hunt. Unlike other serial killers driven by compulsion or rage, Kraft moved with a clinical detachment. He logged his kills with spreadsheet-like detail, recorded cryptic nicknames in a small notebook that authorities would later call the scorecard, and concealed his crimes beneath layers of routine and calculated mobility. He wasn't hiding in plain sight. He was hiding behind order. By the time authorities caught him in 1983, they would connect his list to more than 60 murders. Most of them young men, many never identified, and nearly all staged to appear random or accidental. Randy Kraft had a degree in economics and a sharp, detail-oriented mind. Born in Long Beach, California in 1945, he maintained a low profile through most of his adult life. He worked as a computer consultant and later as a warehouse supervisor, positions that allowed him to work odd hours, travel extensively, and avoid close oversight. To his friends and co-workers, he was methodical, quiet, and unremarkable. He dressed plainly, drove a tan Toyota Celica, and rarely drank in excess. But beneath the calm exterior was a man who kept two lives in perfect synchronization. During the day, he worked in spreadsheets and logistics. At night, he cruised highways and coastal roads, scanning for victims, mostly hitchhikers, military men, or bar patrons alone near closing time. His preference was for men in their late teens to early 20s, often found walking near military bases or bus stops. He'd offer a ride, sometimes laced with alcohol or pills, and engage his victims in seemingly normal conversation until they were isolated enough to be overpowered. Once in control, Kraft moved with surgical precision. His earliest suspected murders date back to 1971, though authorities believe he may have started as early as 1969. The victims often bore signs of chemical sedation, large doses of tranquilizers, barbiturates, or alcohol found in their systems. Autopsies revealed ligature marks, bruising, and in many cases, evidence of prolonged restraint. Some victims had been burned with a cigarette lighter or mutilated in specific, repetitive ways. Yet there was rarely evidence left at the scene. Bodies were dumped along roadsides, under overpasses, or in open fields, staged to appear like overdoses, suicides, or misadventures. In at least a dozen cases, the victims were posed, arms folded across chests, clothes redressed incorrectly, or with items inserted post-mortem. It was staging, and it was deliberate. Kraft wanted control, even after death. But unlike killers who kept trophies, he kept data. That data came in the form of a notebook discovered in his vehicle at the time of his arrest, listing 67 cryptic entries. Each entry had a nickname, a number, or a short reference. Marine Disneyland, EDM, Golden Sails, Portland. The code would take years to unravel, and even then, some of the names would never be matched to actual victims. Kraft's ability to avoid detection for over a decade stemmed in part from his understanding of how law enforcement agencies operated, specifically how poorly they coordinated across jurisdictions in the 1970s and early 80s. Many of his victims were transient or had no fixed address. Several were gay men, a demographic often underreported or ignored in early homicide investigations. Others were military personnel, recently discharged, or on leave. Their disappearances weren't always immediately flagged. When bodies were found in neighboring counties or states, investigators rarely compared notes. DNA profiling didn't exist. Fingerprints were not shared across departments. And unless two cases bore nearly identical signatures, they were treated as unrelated. Kraft exploited that fragmentation. He varied his methods just enough to prevent a forensic pattern from forming, but not so much that it disrupted his process. One victim might be strangled, another drugged, a third mutilated. The variety made him harder to profile and harder to link. But the list, the scorecard, was his undoing. Without it, many of the murders would never have been traced to him. Investigators found it inside a briefcase during his arrest. The list was handwritten, consisting of short, cryptic phrases. Each line was believed to correspond to a victim, though many couldn't be identified. Some were matched through DNA, others through missing person reports and autopsy details. The scorecard revealed a staggering range: victims in Oregon, Michigan, and even Canada, with no clear timeline or escalating pattern. Kraft wasn't progressing. He was maintaining, like a system. One that remained stable for years until a routine traffic stop exposed the machine behind the mask. In May 1983, Kraft was pulled over on the San Diego freeway for weaving between lanes. Officers approached the vehicle and found a man slumped in the passenger seat, unconscious, pants unzipped, with ligature marks around his neck. He was dead. The victim, later identified as Terry Gambrell, a 25-year-old Marine, had been drugged and strangled hours earlier. The passenger seat was soaked in urine and alcohol. In the trunk, officers found ropes, duct tape, a camera, and prescription sedatives. The glove compartment contained coded note cards and a small notebook. The scorecard. That single traffic stop ended the killing career of one of America's most organized serial murderers. But even in custody, Kraft remained methodical. He offered no confession. He asked for an attorney, and for years he maintained his innocence, calling the scorecard a fantasy. For investigators, the real work began after the arrest. Each line of the scorecard had to be cross-referenced against cold cases. Some were obvious. EDM corresponded to Eric Dale Modell, found dumped off Highway 605. Golden Sales matched a salesman discovered outside Golden West College. Others were harder. MC Dump, 76, Westminster date. Without direct evidence, prosecutors could only charge Kraft with 16 murders. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to death. But the real number, experts say, is closer to 67, if not more. The list suggests an internal order, one that only Kraft understood. It wasn't a trophy list. It was an index, a log of completed executions, cleanly recorded, emotionless, like rows in a spreadsheet. Where Alcala took photographs to immortalize his control, Kraft took notes. Where other killers escalated, he optimized. And the chilling part wasn't just the volume, it was the efficiency. The highways he drove became arteries of disposal. The cars he chose were easy to clean, the weapons silent and practical. The victims never saw it coming. And by the time they were missed, they were already listed, reduced to a line of code in a killer's quiet ledger. But the list didn't end with numbers. It ended with gaps, entries that investigators still haven't solved. Some names were matched, others never will be. Victims without identity, cases without bodies. And even now, as Kraft sits on death row, he offers nothing. No explanations, no remorse, no insight into the code. For him, the list speaks loud enough. And just as Kraft used order to mask chaos, the next killer would use survivalism. He didn't kill for a thrill or out of madness. He built a system in which death was the default. Together with a partner, he constructed a hidden bunker in the woods, abducted strangers, recorded their suffering, and documented every act like it was a twisted experiment. Charles Ng and Leonard Lake weren't just killers. They were engineers of captivity. And their dungeon in the California hills would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. The trial of Randy Kraft wasn't a matter of proving he was a killer. It was about proving how many murders he committed. Prosecutors focused on 16 cases with the strongest evidence, including DNA, fiber matches, eyewitness accounts, and entries from his now infamous scorecard. But the number 16 was a fraction of the whole. The notebook contained 67 distinct entries, many of which remained unsolved or could not be definitively linked to a body. Investigators from multiple states, including California, Oregon, Michigan, and even British Columbia, Canada, sent detectives and cold case files to coordinate with the Orange County Task Force. Dozens of unidentified bodies found near freeways or coastal routes in the 1970s and early 1980s matched Kraft's victim profile and timeline. In several cases, the physical injuries, ligature marks, chemical sedation, mutilation mirrored those seen in confirmed Kraft victims. But without definitive evidence or surviving witnesses, the entries on his scorecard remained chilling symbols of lives erased and identities stolen. Each day in court, prosecutors laid out a timeline that painted a picture of a killer who was organized to a fault. Kraft didn't make mistakes. He chose victims who were often isolated or disconnected from stable social networks. Military personnel on leave, young gay men estranged from family, hitchhikers without a paper trail. His method of sedation ensured victims rarely had time to resist or leave physical evidence. Investigators discovered that he often drugged his victims with a combination of alcohol and prescription sedatives, such as Ativan or Valium, dosed into drinks or given in pill form. Once unconscious, the victims were restrained using nylon ropes, belts, or electrical cords. Some were strangled quickly. Others were subjected to longer torture sessions marked by burn patterns, deep bruising, or internal injuries. These elements weren't accidental. They were structured and deliberate. Kraft had studied how to extend pain without immediate death, and the chilling consistency in his victim handling suggested that his killing wasn't about impulse, it was about control. One of the most disturbing elements of the trial was the introduction of Kraft's photographs. Along with the scorecard, authorities had recovered dozens of Polaroids, some showing victims either unconscious or deceased, others posing normally before what investigators believe was their eventual abduction. In a few, victims were still alive, their eyes dazed, their expressions blank. Prosecutors argued that these images functioned as part of Kraft's ritual. Not trophies, but milestones. Each photo was time-stamped. Each added a layer of verification to his otherwise deniable crimes. Alongside the photos were typed entries in a personal ledger Kraft had maintained, noting travel dates, vehicle mileage, and shifts in work schedule. When cross-referenced with murder dates and body recovery sites, the correlations were undeniable. Kraft had essentially built a forensic roadmap, a one-man audit trail of murder, disguised as logistics, and it had been sitting in his briefcase the entire time. The defense attempted to undermine the evidence by suggesting alternate suspects, gaps in the timeline, and inconsistencies in the scorecard's language. They argued that the coded names were fantasy, a dark fiction created by a disturbed mind, not proof of real crimes. But forensic testimony destroyed that narrative. DNA recovered from multiple victims matched Kraft. Hair and fiber evidence connected his home, vehicle, and storage unit to victim belongings. Tool mark analysis on ligature injuries showed similarities in restraint methods across geographically distant crime scenes. Toxicology reports on victims demonstrated identical drug compounds in matching doses. There was no longer a question of guilt, only the scale of it. And while the prosecution could only charge him with 16 murders, investigators left no doubt that Randy Kraft's scorecard was far more than fiction. It was an accounting, a true body count. In 1989, Kraft was convicted on 16 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was remanded to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row. His demeanor has not changed. He doesn't speak publicly about the case. He doesn't correspond with journalists. And he doesn't engage with appeals beyond legal technicalities. His silence is strategic. The victims whose names he did not record or whose code words remain unsolved have never been identified. In at least 10 instances, law enforcement possesses only skeletal remains, found decades ago along interstates and labeled as John Doe's. Facial reconstruction, isotope analysis, and familial DNA have helped in some cases, but the full list remains incomplete. Kraft has never provided additional information. Investigators continue to cross-reference cold cases against the scorecard, but the true number of victims may never be known. The legacy of Randy Kraft is one of precision, not passion. He didn't kill in rage. He killed in order, with a system, with restraint, with structure. His crimes weren't about chaos, but calculation. And in that, he remains a singular figure in American criminal history. The scorecard sits in evidence storage, sealed under temperature-controlled preservation, still being studied by criminologists and behavioral analysts. It reads like a spreadsheet, but between its lines lie entire lifetimes, erased, renamed, and buried. And yet, even among serial killers who track and log their actions, there are few who took their obsession with pattern and record-keeping as far as the man who came next, where Kraft categorized his victims by cryptic shorthand. Joseph Naso used full names, and a pattern so specific it would take years for law enforcement to believe it was real. His victims all shared a common thread. Their first and last names began with the same letter. And while that detail might seem like coincidence, Naso's handwritten death diary revealed otherwise. He wasn't killing randomly, he was alphabetizing. The deeper investigators went into Joseph Naso's archive, the more disturbing the picture became. His collection wasn't just vast, it was deliberately structured. Tucked away in boxes inside locked safes were not only thousands of photographs, but handwritten index cards detailing physical traits, poses, and sometimes cryptic descriptors of where and how he met each woman. Many of the images were time-stamped. Some included annotations like "second visit," "didn't want to pose," or simply "no return." Detectives quickly realized they weren't dealing with disorganized trophies or nostalgic keepsakes. They were analyzing a personalized database of surveillance, tracking, and target cataloging. The images spanned decades, with victims ranging from young adults to middle-aged women. Most were photographed alone, often in motel rooms, cheap apartments, or empty parks. Some appeared to be asleep or unconscious. In several, women were seen in the same bed or wearing identical clothing, suggesting repeat visits or controlled environments. The consistency in location, composition, and labeling signaled not artistic obsession, but logistical planning. Forensic analysts broke down the photos into categories: voluntary, coerced, and post-mortem. Each classification was built on subtle details: eye movement, posture, skin tone, environmental context. In the coerced group, subjects often looked frozen in compliance, arms stiff at their sides, clothing disheveled. Their surroundings were sparse: a blank wall, stained carpeting, a cheap desk lamp casting uneven shadows. The post-mortem category was harder to confirm, but impossible to ignore. In a few images, the women were clearly unresponsive, pupils dilated, bodies limp in ways the living cannot mimic. Authorities could not identify all of them. Some were matched to missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s. Others remained Jane Does, their identities still unknown, their last moments catalogued in a killer's photo box. And even those whose names were uncovered offered little comfort. Their families had been searching for decades, believing the trail had long gone cold. The photos became more than evidence. They were the final, undeniable record of crimes committed in silence. The most critical piece of evidence tying Naso to confirmed murders came not just from the photos, but from the handwritten death diary found in his safe. Alongside victim names and brief location notes were numbers, sequential entries that appeared to function as chronological logging. Forensic teams cross-referenced these entries with missing persons databases, then compared the physical descriptions with the photos and geographic data logged in his travel receipts and gasoline mileage journals. Naso had driven extensively across California and Nevada. He kept gas station receipts, often annotated with pen marks indicating detours or side roads. When matched against dump sites where bodies had been found, the pattern emerged. His record-keeping, once believed to be mundane or neurotic, was actually a murder trail. Each receipt told a story. Each scribbled note held significance. It wasn't random. It was structured, a forensic spreadsheet of murder routes hiding in plain sight. In court, Nasso's behavior added another layer of chilling distance to the crimes. Acting as his own attorney, he cross-examined witnesses with a tone devoid of empathy. He smiled at odd moments. He interrupted testimony with unrelated personal anecdotes. He spoke about his photography like a proud collector, dismissing the images as harmless fantasy or creative study. He downplayed the death diary as just a list of women I liked. But the evidence was overwhelming. Jurors listened to forensic experts explain the handwriting matches, the time-stamped Polaroids, the matching fibers found on victim clothing. DNA evidence, though limited due to age and degradation, placed Nasso at scenes he denied visiting. Defense arguments crumbled under the weight of procedural evidence. One juror later described the case as watching a man try to defend himself against his own paper trail. The jury deliberated just over a day. The verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The sentence: death. In 2013, Nasso was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. His cell now holds no cameras, no safes, no boxes of photographs, just concrete, metal, and silence. He no longer documents. He no longer records. The lists have ended. But outside his cell, the investigation continues. Several names remain uncoded in his death diary. Their identities unknown, families without closure, bodies without names. Detectives in multiple counties continue to cross-reference Nasso's photographs with missing person cases, hoping one more face might be recognized, one more case might be closed. For every confirmed murder, there's another line in his journal left unclaimed. That uncertainty has become part of his legacy, a ledger of the lost. What sets Joseph Nasso apart from the others in this compilation isn't just the method of killing or the number of victims, it's the system behind the violence, the structured, alphabetized, annotated system. Like Randy Kraft's scorecard and Rodney Alcala's photo archive, Nasso's death diary functioned as a form of ownership, a psychological filing cabinet. He didn't just kill, he collected. And that distinction, the compulsion to organize murder, reveals a mind less driven by impulse than by obsession. For Nasso, order wasn't just a preference. It was the framework that made killing possible. Every entry, every snapshot, every receipt added to the illusion of control. But in the end, that control failed. His vaults were opened, his archive dismantled, his own handwriting used against him. And in that unraveling, the faceless women behind his photos were finally seen, not as images or entries, but as people. Their lives, long erased by time and geography, were given context. Their stories, long buried, were revived in courtrooms and forensic labs. And while not all will be identified, the investigation continues, pixel by pixel, name by name. In true crime, the line between fact and silence is often razor thin. Most killers leave chaos, others leave codes, and it's the ones who seem the most organized, the ones who plan, catalog, and quietly vanish, who often cause the most damage, because their violence isn't loud, it's silent, clinical, hidden behind routines and false names, but eventually, the details betray them. The logs, the ledgers, the lists. And when they do, the mask slips, revealing not monsters, but men. Men who thought structure would save them. Men who believed they could outlive memory. But in the end, it was memory that caught them. Their crimes are written now, recorded, preserved, not in their own words, but in the evidence they left behind. And while their names will remain infamous, it's the names they tried to erase. Carmen Colon, Tracy Tafoya, Pamela Parsons, Roxane Rogish, that deserve to be remembered. Because in true crime, it's not the killer's pattern that defines the legacy, it's the lives they tried to make disappear.